fact is that the whole world is impacted. So probably there are other countries which are impacted even more. So
whenever there is a big crisis in the crude oil rates, the government has reduced the tax that it imposes on petrol and diesel.
every $10 increase in the crude oil prices necessitates a 5 rupees increase in petrol and diesel price at the consumer end. I don't think government of India can help not increase the retail prices.
Hello and welcome. You're watching me, Sanket Upadhyay, on the Federal. The show is called AI with Sanket. This is the AI of news because news in India today requires not artificial but analytical intelligence. There is a crisis. Because of the war between Iran and the United States, there is a massive crisis. India is also in the midst of managing a crisis, and that crisis is related to our energy needs. The government, after initially launching sources and source-based information on how we are well equipped to handle this crisis, has invoked the Essential Services Act. And what you see on your screen right now is the Gazette notification which has been released. This is obviously related to petroleum and natural gas department. Now, let me quickly tell you the salient features also. The government says 100% assured supply to domestic piped gas in home and CNG for vehicles. 80% of the previous 6 months average supply to tea industries manufacturing. 80% of previous 6 months supply to industrial and commercial natural gas consumers, which means that our industry is going to be hit because of this crisis. 70% of the previous 6 months average supply to fertilizer plants, which means it is going to hit agriculture. Natural gas supply has been cut from refineries, a 35% cut, and as well as petrochemicals. Now, the government says India was getting 30% of its natural gas from Hormuz, and through this control order, priorities have been set for natural gas. India is purchasing natural gas from other routes to set off the short supply. So in the short term, there is definitely going to be a crisis of natural gas, and how that is being managed has now been dictated by the government. However, this is not the end. Since the war shows no sign of ebbing, are we to assume that very soon this crisis and essential services will be affected for petrol and diesel as well? We discuss. Joining us right now is Mr. Debashish Mishra. He's the Chief Growth Officer at Deloitte, South Asia. Thank you very much, Mr. Mishra. I want to understand your assessment of where this crisis vis-a-vis India's energy needs stands.
Thanks, Sanket. Thanks for having me over. Obviously, it's one of those black swan events and a big crisis that's hit the energy world. And given the fact that India imports 88% of its oil requirement, the crude requirement, and almost 50% of the gas and quite a lot of LPG, and we depend a lot in the supplies from the Middle East that passes through the Hormuz choke point. Obviously, India is impacted immensely. So there is no two ways about it that India is impacted, but different fuel categories are impacted differently. When it comes to oil, India has strategic reserve, and given the fact that India has refining capacity way beyond its own requirement, in the system, in the refining system, in the pipeline system, in the storage system, there is enough oil to take care of India for, let's say, a couple of weeks. But when it comes to LPG and LNG import, which goes into city gas distribution, there the amount of cushion is very less. That's why we have started seeing the scarcity of LPG in the commercial segment. So hotels are now complaining. Now soon we'll have problem in the city gas distribution segment, the pipe natural gas segment also. So two things I'll separate. One is the availability, other is the price impact. So obviously we'll come to the price impact later, but the first thing first is that if the crisis continues, the first segments that will get impacted is the city gas distribution and the LPG segment. As of now, India is doing fine with respect to petrol and diesel.
Now, if let's just assume that this situation, this conflict will continue for a while. If that happens, how long can we sustain or push away an LNG crisis, a CNG or a PNG, and an LPG crisis? And how soon before we will not be able to insulate even petrol and diesel prices or absorb petrol and diesel prices?
So as I mentioned, you see, India, 50% of India's gas requirement comes as LNG, and most of it comes from Qatar. And as you know, that Qatar is, in that beyond the choke point where they are not able to send even a single cargo. So that will be the first one which will get impacted, because in India's domestic production will probably supply to fertilizer plants and some amount of domestic gas supplies in cities. That's why the commercial segment of LPG already starting to get the impact. You look at the LPG part of it, India imports a lot of LPG from Saudi, and the refineries that India has, they produce around 14-15 million metric ton of LPG, and government of India has already revoked all its powers to ask the refineries to produce more LPG. So LPG, maybe it will get ramped up and probably get backfilled. But when it comes to gas, that's the difficult proposition, and there will be impact on city gas distribution in the gas segment, which is basically CNG and PNG.
This is huge because, see, the moment it hits piped natural gas and compressed natural gas, you know that automobile is going to be hit, and CNG forms the backbone of commercial mobility also. And most importantly, piped natural gas, because at least in our major cities, as you are saying, most of the cities now have piped gas, and they're not
Yeah.
dependent on the LPG cylinder, though there is a price hike there as well. uh, how does one ensure that this gets controlled? I mean, are we now totally and completely dependent on this Qatar route, and there is no way
For
to
50,
insulate?
for 50% of our requirement, obviously, LNG is something which can come from Australia and from US and other places also. These are, the other two large sources of LNG. But it's not easy to get a cargo immediately, bring it to the regasification terminal and put it in the pipes. So there will be a bit of a crisis in the middle, but given the fact that a lot of it goes to fertilizer, probably the planners and policymakers are looking at it that who gets priority so that there is minimum disruption. So obviously there will be scarcity, but in terms of you get the priorities right, then there will be minimum disruption.
If 50% of our gas needs, LPG and LNG needs, come from Qatar, and we have no
LPG
access
comes
to
from
that
Saudi. LPG
South.
comes from Saudi, which is also impacted. Yeah, which
Yeah,
is also
exactly.
impacted.
So the Gulf countries, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if we were to assume that this war continues, what are the options that can immediately be considered so that the impact is minimized? I understand what you are saying, that if you reroute or try to get it from other sources, to immediately get it and put it in those pipes is not going to be easy. So, what is this window that we are looking at for studying and executing the alternatives?
Yeah, so the other, see, the thing is, when it comes to LPG, which the refineries also, it's a byproduct of refinery also. So Indian refiners can also tweak a bit and produce more LPG, and which is what they have been instructed by the government of India to do it. But these processes, again, I'm not a technical expert in refinery, but maybe it will take probably a week or so. I don't know, but that's possible provided you have crude in the system. But crude itself is getting disrupted because India imports around more than 5 million barrel a day, and almost half of it comes through Gulf, that choke point of Hormuz, and that's also getting impacted. So crude coming from other sources and India using its strategic reserve and whatever reserve refineries have, because that has to be converted to LPG, means then it gets getting diverted from petrol and diesel. Ultimately, it's the same refinery is going to be used for different output. So it's a very, it's a balancing act, but the fact is that the whole world is impacted. So probably there are other countries which are impacted even more. So the probably everybody, it is in everybody's interest that the crisis ends sooner than later. So
Now, let's talk about the last point. You briefly mentioned petrol and diesel. You see, these refineries are going to take crude and then convert it and refine it to petrol and diesel, not just for India, but then also export it. That is what most of Indian refineries do. Now,
yeah.
here is my proposition. In a situation like this, where you have crude already jumping to $120 a barrel and there is no sign of ebbing, how soon before the government will not be able to insulate the petrol and diesel price?
See, Sanket, what had happened is quite smartly, Government of India had not changed the retail prices for quite some time. If you recall, I mean, oil has been hovering around $60-62 a barrel for a long time. Although rupee has depreciated significantly, because it goes into both the elements go hand in hand, because that both, you everything in the oil value chain is done in terms of US dollar, and even the refining margins. But because the lower oil price benefit was not passed on to consumer, probably the oil marketing companies had some kind of cushion, because oil was hovering at a low 60s for quite some time, and petrol prices in the retail end never changed. But that cannot be sustained, because this is the thumb rule, Sanket. Every $10 increase in the crude oil prices necessitates a 5 rupees increase in petrol and diesel price at the consumer end. So if you see that it has increased by $50 in last few days, it almost like it requires a 50 rupees increase in retail price, which is not going to happen, which if only if it sustains, that will happen. But beyond certain levels, I think probably if it continues for more than a couple of months or month, I don't think Government of India can help not increase the retail prices.
Now, one of the things that we have seen in the past that the government has done is, whenever there is a big crisis in the crude oil rates, the government has reduced the tax that it imposes on petrol and diesel, so that for the end consumer the price remains the same, or there is a lowering of the price. Do you feel that this is an option that the government can consider to perhaps, number one, soften the blow, and number two, reduce or basically add a cushion? So if your price of petrol has gone up, your taxes have come down, effectively reducing the passing
Yeah.
on the burden.
Yeah, that's the thing. As you know that petrol and diesel is not part of the GST regime. So it has an element of the central excise and what states also charge. And in the past, we have seen that's taken as a balancing figure to reduce the impact on the consumer. Thankfully, India's both, the twin deficit, both current account deficit is hovering around 1%, and inflation is also not very high. And the part of the reason is that the retail inflation is low is also because fuel prices have been constant. So there is a headroom, I think, available for everybody. Whether government can reduce the taxes, consumer can probably take 10 15 rupees more without overall inflation really going out of control. So there is that headroom, thankfully, available with India. And as I mentioned that, India is in a much better place when it comes to crude and petrol and diesel compared to many other countries in the world. Already we have seen crisis in smaller nations. So, yeah.
All right, Debashish Mishra, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanket. Thank you. Bye bye.